Hello again. In this video, we're going to talk about economic trends in the United States and the effect that the coronavirus or COVID has had on those trends. And we will see that the impact of COVID has been quite severe in several cases. So the purpose of this review is simply to acknowledge the business conditions that we are facing currently and how they're changing. So with that, let me see if I can get things started with the PowerPoints here. That's always a challenge for me. Okay, so we're talking about U.S. economic trends in a COVID world. Now, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that economic trends today are not the same as they were just a few years ago. And they even are not the same as you often hear about in the media, where we are prone to hear China described as the second largest economy in the world. As you can see from this diagram, that's not true. China's economy is significantly larger than the US economy when we use the appropriate measurement, which is purchasing power parity. What goods and services can currency in each country acquire? And we find out that China's economy is larger than the US economy and much smaller, but still in number 3 position is India's economy. Japan's economy used to be considered a very large economy, and in fact it is, and it's quite sophisticated, but Japan is no longer one of the top 3 industrial economies of the world. However, I must add that India's economy is far less sophisticated and has a long way to go before it can rival or be discussed in terms similar to the US, China, and Japan, or the other, most of the other countries in this exhibit, particularly those in Europe. But it's helpful to simply remember that the US economy is now in a much more competitive circumstance than it used to be, and that China is challenging the United States on many fronts. And of course, here's the situation that we're all familiar with, COVID, and how it has exploded and impacted countries all over the world. Although COVID is under control more or less in the United States, it's not under control to the same extent in South America and countries such as Brazil and Argentina, or in Eastern Europe, including Russia. And we all are probably aware that the Olympic Games in Tokyo, Japan, are much different than in prior years because no one is allowed to watch the games from the stadiums and the stands that and auditoriums that had been built for the Olympic Games in Japan. But COVID is so severe there that the audiences had to be denied access. And then we see over on the right of this chart a new development, the Delta variant. And again, I'm assuming that you've undoubtedly heard a fair amount about Delta already, but you can see that there is a surge over on the right side. And the right side ends on July 30th of this year, 2021. As I speak to you, it's beginning the second week of August, and that surge continues. And there is much in the news about the Delta variant, and among other things, how to manage it as folks go back to school. One of the problems with the Delta variant is that it is highly communicable, apparently about 8 times more than the original coronavirus. And it's even able to pass through the barriers, the antibodies that are produced as a result of vaccinations. So the new Delta variant is a major contingency, and likely we will see that that spike, that spurt over on the right side of the graph grow up higher before it goes back down again. And what this means to business conditions, of course, is what has us all worried. It could be that we'll be able to manage it because vaccinations are effective generally. And in the United States, we've got a higher rate of vaccinations than in other countries. But we trade with other countries that don't have such high vaccination rates. And so here we are then with a question about the US economy, because our economy is influenced greatly by international trade. So here are a few statistics that I gathered just about a week ago before I made this video. And I strongly urge you to go to the Johns Hopkins University website. Right here, I've provided it to you. When you go there, you'll know why I would like you to go there. It's an excellent, outstanding website, and it portrays all the basic data that you need with graphics that are very easy to look at. And it's just a very impressive website. And of course, every day, the data that you see on this table change. But these data were assembled from that site on August 3. And you can see that the US has had the most cases of coronavirus and the most deaths. However, as a proportion of those cases, the deaths are less than 2%. Still too many, but not a large proportion. India, on the other hand, has fewer recorded deaths and fewer COVID cases recorded. However, I've put a little footnote because India is widely disregarded for its statistical record keeping. And there have been occasions when folks who are responsible for these data in India, particularly when the administration changed recently, or not too recently, but some time ago, it was acknowledged that one of the tasks the new administration was going to try to come to grips with is getting more accurate statistics of a civilian, political, healthcare, and so forth nature. Brazil, you can see, doesn't have as many cases, but that's relative. 20 million is a lot of cases, not as high as 32 million in India or 35 in the United States, but it's a smaller country, and its death rate was up to about 2.8%, which is getting pretty high. Brazil is one of those countries that is being overwhelmed by the Delta variant, and the vaccination rate in Brazil is not very high. So Brazil has a big problem. Russia, you can see, drops down. And by the way, these countries are in order of the number of cases. So after the top three, the numbers drop down quite a bit. Now, one item that is not here is the European Union combined. If we had the European Union combined, it would be up here in the top 3 or 4 as well. But you can see that Russia also has had a high death rate from the coronavirus. And again, Russia is one of those countries that doesn't have a high rate of vaccination. And so the new Delta virus variant has been a major problem for Russia. Here are is a portrayal of advanced economies and emerging economies and how they were affected during the first year of the coronavirus. Here you can see this is at this point we have the beginning of 2021. So I should have probably put a line here, and I can certainly do so now. But that's January 24th of 21. So if I were to put a line up here, there, I think you can see that. So to the left of the line I just drew is the first year, 2020, and to the right is 2021, the year that we're in now. And so when we come down here to this chart, we can appreciate the severity of economic impact that COVID has had among advanced countries. Spain in particular had an economic decline of 11%, England or the United Kingdom 10%, France and Italy 9%, but very, very severe reductions economically. So the US, with a reduction of 3.5%, really came out a lot better than other countries did. When we get down to the emerging countries, I should probably have put one other circle here, and that's to cover China, because China had a positive change in its economy, not nearly as high as in prior years, but still positive. All the other countries had a decline in their economies. India, 8% decline. Mexico, our southern neighbor, 8.5%. And South Africa, the largest economy in that part of Africa, the sub-Saharan Africa, 7.5% decline. These are all major changes. For the current year, the World Economic Outlook, the International Monetary Fund, anticipated when this was published an 8% growth in China and an 11% growth in India. However, more recently, the IMF has recognized that India is really wrestling with this Delta variant, and its forecast now is closer, I believe, to 8%. So these numbers are being revised as we see changes in the Delta variant and the way it is occurring. Once again, the purpose of showing this information is to remind you that the United States trades with many countries, including China, but also India, with countries in Europe and elsewhere in the world, including South America, Mexico. And to the extent that these economies have suffered and still may be suffering, notwithstanding these friendlier estimates from the IMF. Not all those estimates will come true because COVID and the Delta variant continue to impose the hardships on some of these economies, making it more difficult for the US to trade productively with those countries. So here's the way the economy changed when COVID hit and in 2020. And so in the second quarter, the US economy dropped 30%. Remarkable, isn't it? On the other hand, it recovered in the following quarter by 34%. So the US has done a really good job in some respects of recovering from the effects of COVID. The problem is how the US economy achieved that recovery. What was done to accomplish those results. One thing that, before we get into the impact of borrowing and debt and stimulus payments, which are part of the answers to this question, one other thing that we need to bear in mind is that balances of payments can have an impact on economic aggregates as well as a nation's currency. So here we have the difference between exports and imports. And the US has imported a great deal more than it has exported to other countries. And that difference has been aggravated by the coronavirus. And so we can look at the scale over here and see that whereas we had about a 50 billion, maybe even a $45 billion deficit, more recently, it's something more than $70 billion, and that's per month. So these are large differences. What it means is that there's a lot less demand for dollars in currency exchange and a lot more demand in by the US, among others, for currency of the nations from whom we buy goods and services, which drives up the value of that currency and drives US currency down. There are other factors driving US currency down, including these large amounts of federal debt. So if we take a look at US currency exchange rates, what we see in the case of China is that the US dollar buys a lot fewer yuan than it did some time ago. I was in China somewhere around here, and yeah, as a matter of fact, it must have been a little earlier. I think we got about 6.5 yuan to the dollar, maybe a little more. Now you can see that it's not quite as generous, and it's been declining. The same for the Canadian dollar. US dollar buys fewer Canadian dollars. In the case of the euro, let me see if I can move this. I hope I can. Whoops. Better be careful here. Well, that helped a little bit. We can see that it takes more dollars to buy a euro when, in the case of euros and British pound sterling, we have to invert the fraction. Here we're talking about foreign currency per dollar. Now we're talking about dollars per euro. It's just the way the numbers are presented. But this chart and this chart and this chart are all the same. The value of the dollar has declined. It has in Japan, although there's been a resurgence recently. So Japan, not quite like the others. You can see that India, the US dollar was buying a lot more Indian currency because India's economy has had its difficulties. Nevertheless, during the past year, since the coronavirus, that trend was reversed, as it has been in Russia as well. So what does this mean to you and me? What this means is that if we care to buy, or if a company in the United States cares to buy goods and services in these other countries, today it will have to spend more US dollars to buy the very same amount of goods or services that were purchased a year ago, sometimes by a very large margin, sometimes not. But that's the situation anyway, because of factors that we'll be talking about. One is inflation, the other is debt, but the effect on our currency has been to lower its value, which means you and I have to pay more for those goods and services, and that affects our living conditions, our lifestyle. Takes us more to purchase goods and services than it did a year ago. Here, in fact, is a portrayal of US federal debt. And you can see that the debt as a proportion of our gross domestic product really shot up during the coronavirus. Now, it was already just barely over 100%, but by the end of last year, early this in the first quarter of this year, it had really shot up. It was about 135% of GDP at the end of 2000, and more recently, at the end of our first quarter, 128%. Similarly, consumer debt has come up pretty sharply over the long term. We will see in these charts several long-term trends as well as short-term trends. but consumer debt is certainly substantial. The federal debt as of June 1st of this year was some $38 trillion. And that is substantially more than the GDP. And you can see how sharply it has risen. It's risen in order to provide federal stimulus payments to people who either have not been employed, to small business owners and shop owners, and to sometimes to governments, but all in the attempt to offset the adverse impacts of recession caused by COVID. Now, the question is, as the US economy has recovered, do we still need to have this kind of debt? And the reason that's an important question is because there are in Congress today proposals to add another $5 trillion to debt, 1.5 for so-called infrastructure, which is probably worthwhile, and another 3.5 for social programs, which may not be worthwhile, but the Democrats are in power in the U.S. Congress, and they are promoting increased amounts of debt for those social programs. And the question is, at what point does the US economy become unable to support that debt? And at what point does that debt create such inflation that price rises, price increases in the United States become unaffordable and out of control? So here's another way to look at it. In July of this year, the money supply, that is currency in circulation and short-term debt. I'm sorry, I can't remember the term right now. But this is essentially liquid capital, was about $20.5 trillion. A year prior, it was 18.3 trillion. And so the increase was about 12%. That's faster than the economy grew. And so the difference between the growth of the money supply and growth of the GDP, and you may recall that there was a decline in GDP, that will have an effect on prices. And to explain this, the way this works a little better, I've prepared a sort of a funny little story, a make-believe story about the price of coconuts, and I've posted it in your website. And it's very brief and easy to read, but it will show you why, as the money supply goes up, prices tend to go up as well. And as I've mentioned earlier, recent federal spending proposals could increase, I think could is probably a better term, because we don't know how much of the spending would be from money that is already available versus new money created by new debt. But it could be 5 trillion or more. And of course, that would really increase the money supply relative to the GDP which would inflate the money supply, and inflation brings higher prices. Here's another way to look at it, and the term is the velocity of money. Back in 1981, the gross domestic product was about 3.5 times the size of the money supply. And again, this is there are several definitions of money supply. The most common is M2, and that's why I've used it here. As I've mentioned, the money supply is growing faster than the economy. And lo and behold, in the second quarter of 2020, the GDP, instead of being 3.5 times the size of the money supply, was slightly smaller, just about 1 times money supply. So, and more recently, it was 1.2 times money supply. This means that the money supply is moving through the economy much more slowly. That's because the amount of money has inflated. So the velocity of money flowing through the economy has declined drastically in recent years, and then most recently, this last dip down. So that's the situation that we're dealing with. Now, let's talk about the consumer here for a while, the real weekly earnings. By real, we mean after inflation. Even after that high inflation dropped dramatically in the first quarter of 2021. That we've heard lots of reasons for that, but it's basically due to unemployment, prior to which the economy was growing and earnings were growing quite substantially. But then COVID and the recession hit, and boy, US consumers really took it in the chops. However, some consumers did not suffer. They did not become unemployed. The folks who got unemployed tended to be lower income people who worked in restaurants and bars and in some labor capacity jobs and in, among other things, airlines. But in many of the industries where employment dropped, the folks who lost their income were not highly paid anyway. On the other hand, people who kept their jobs, managers and so forth, got the stimulus payments from the government just like these people did. But they didn't need those stimulus payments, they just got them. And so what happened was that they saved those stimulus payments, and the saving rate, the portion of disposable personal income that was not spent by consumers who didn't really need those stimulus payments, their saving rates jumped up to 24%, as opposed to perhaps a norm of about 7 or 8% more recently. So there have been two worlds here. The world of people who needed the stimulus payments, and when they got the stimulus payments, spent them because they needed to pay rent. Many of them don't pay rent, but to buy groceries and meet basic needs, as opposed to people who were much better off and simply put the stimulus payments in the bank. So we have a rather unusual set of circumstances when we were looking at income and spending. We can see during COVID that there was a substantial decline in wages and salaries, and that yet by the end of 2020, which is at this point here, there had been a pretty good recovery. Not to the point that we can celebrate success. I can sort of drop a line here to illustrate that we had made the change, we had recovered, again, largely due to stimulus programs. But the U.S. did recover as it proceeded into the current year. But previously, of course, there was some difficulty. And really, for the first half of 2020, after the first quarter, wages and salaries were still below where they were and where they should have been. You know, this line should have continued to move up. But the U.S. economy has begun to recover. Not everyone that was laid off has been rehired, sometimes because they don't want to be rehired, since those stimulus payments are enough to get by. They don't feel they need to go back to work. So here's real personal income, and it has the benefit of these stimulus payments. And again, let me see if I can drop a line here just to make the difference. There we are. So to the left is 2020, and to the right is 2021. And so personal income has shot up partly due to stimulus payments, partly due to people going back to work. But if you've heard in the news very much about this situation, even though we are hiring, recently hired quite a large number of people, over 900 million went back to 900,000 went back to work. There are some 8 million people that still are not employed. So although the numbers employment-wise are better, they are not good enough. Real expenditures, personal consumption expenditures. This is just another word for consumer spending, but that'll do it. And so we can see that consumer spending really dove down when the coronavirus began and took quite a while to recover. As a matter of fact, it did not recover all the way in 2020, but in 2021 seems to be doing so. Again, how much of that new spending is due to wages as opposed to wages plus stimulus payments? And finally, simply another version excuse me, of the saving rate. And you can see that the saving rate, here, I'll make another copy and bring it down to, there we go. So you can see that the saving rate shot up just as it did in that last, I think we had a graph of the saving rate in the last slide, and you may recall that spike due to stimulus payments. So, do people need these stimulus payments any longer? Would it be better if they didn't have the stimulus payments so that they would have a greater incentive to go back to work? And that's a topic that is debated quite heavily in Congress today. Okay, so we'll talk now about the ability of people to buy the things they need, the so-called consumer purchasing power. And one of the things that you can see is in the upper left-hand corner is that there's a long-term trend here that is just as important as the short-term trend, where consumers' purchasing power has been declining. It's sometimes due to the value of U.S. currency, simply sometimes due to inflation. Very often, wages have not risen as fast as prices. But whatever the particular reasons may be, U.S. consumer purchasing power has been declining for several years. And since the COVID recession, consumer purchasing power has plummeted. And you can see also that the consumer price index more is part of the reason for that recent plummet, because the US consumer price index has really shot up. And we can take a look at how it has occurred in several categories that are important to you and me. In the upper right-hand corner, you see food and beverages. And quite remarkably, it costs more for us to go to the grocery store than it used to. Used cars and new cars have shot up. There are a lot of reasons for that, not least of which is the shortage of electronic components for cars. And I'm sure that you've heard about that in the news as well. And finally, the cost of housing in the cities, primarily maintenance and rent. But you can see in more recently that the price for housing in cities has also turned up. So we're dealing with a situation where consumer prices have really begun to shoot up. Here we have some more consumer prices to simply round out the picture. And once again, you'll notice that most of them, not all, but most, have turned up. Home rent is sort of like the city housing, but that's just for all rentals, and that has actually decelerated a little bit because there's been less demand for new housing, new rental housing. The price for gasoline, I'm sure you've noticed, has gone up quite rapidly in recent months, and you can see it on this chart. I believe that a number that I heard recently was that gasoline at the pump has shot up recently by something like 45%. So that's a really sharp increase. Medical care has not increased. The cost of medical care hasn't increased as much as in the past. And the reason is that people cannot get elective surgery, which is where hospitals enjoy higher pricing. Um, the reason for that is that the wards are full of COVID patients, and with all the coronavirus patients and the strain on hospital staff that it provides imposes, there's not enough opportunity or capacity to accommodate patients that who will pay higher prices for elective surgery, among other things. The price of new homes in the Case-Shiller Home Price Index has shot up dramatically as people wanted to move from cities where we have a lot of crime. I'm sure that you've seen that in the news. And people have the ability these days to work away from home now. Because of the coronavirus, we found new ways of doing work from home, and people have decided that they would like to have homes further away from the city, sometimes with an extra room to turn into an office. In any event, the price for homes has shot up. The demand for air travel has declined, and with it, the price for air travel, it's begun to recover now, the fares have, but air travel has a long way to go before it gets back to normal. And then the price for energy, and again, in the cities, we see that there has not been too much of an increase until just recently. And as the recession occurred, the demand for energy fell, and the demand, and that had a negative impact on prices. So with that, let's move on. Here's an interesting summary chart that just shows some long-term trends in consumer goods and services prices. And for those of you who are watching this video because you're taking my course in strategy, you will notice that the cost of college tuition and fees and textbooks have come up pretty dramatically. And the reasons for that have a lot to do with government regulation and government financing. Since the government finances a lot of student debt, the money is available, and educational institutions are able to raise their prices. Hospital services have certainly gone up dramatically. Medical care services have, and so forth. The red lines on the top part of this chart sometimes reflect the fact that government is highly involved in those goods and services in those industries. And on the other hand, the lower part of this chart with the blue and dark lines reflect industries where very often products or components of products come from overseas: televisions, toys, computer software, cell phone services, all from offshore, clothing, household furnishings, even new cars, not to the same extent, and you can see that their prices haven't declined to the same extent either. But in any event, if you're interested to know where pricing trends have been favorable and unfavorable, you just need to look at this chart. So this takes us to retail sales. How have we how has the US economy been faring with regard to retail sales? In December of last year, retail sales were $485 billion. By March of this year, 560, an increase of 15%. So we know that incomes haven't gone up that much. And so probably we're seeing some of those stimulus payments being spent as well. However, a significant part of this increase, in fact, is due to higher employment and more people receiving wages. As long as we remember that a large portion of the population still is unemployed. And I think there's a chart that'll show us that. Okay, so retail sales trends, the eating and drinking places, that was widely publicized, but you can see that in 2020, that industry did not recover to its pre-COVID level and is just in the process of doing so. Grocery stores are an interesting story because with people moving their work to home because of COVID and the necessity of social distancing, many people moved to do their work at home. You might just ask yourself a question, can people do that in other countries? And where they don't have the kind of technology and the ability to buy personal computers and such, this might not have occurred. But in the United States, grocery sales really picked up because people moved home. You can see that here, as the recovery occurred, grocery store sales moderated, but have leveled off at a point which is substantially higher than the pre-COVID level, which tells me that a lot of people are staying home. They're not going back to the office, but they've moved to a new location where they've moved their office to home, and that there's a new level of grocery store sales because there's a new level of working from home. Clothing prices, again, the same sort of you can almost see the similarities between eating and drinking places and clothing. But as people go back to office, they're starting to go back to the clothing stores to get clothes to wear to work. Nevertheless, in 2020, this industry took a big setback, just like the eating and drinking industry did. Gasoline stations did too. There wasn't as much need to drive to work, so we had this rather substantial decline. Auto dealers, on the other hand, they took a big hit, but then became very aggressive in selling new cars. And what's remarkable here is that they were selling inventory because they were having difficulty getting new inventory since it was more difficult to produce more cars with the shortages of semiconductors. You can see, though, that their sales have picked up substantially this year. And furniture and home furnishings again, the decline, but then a rapid recovery as many people moved out of the city and built new homes or acquired new homes and did their work from home. You can see that that trend is continuing. So we got basically a picture where 2020 was pretty rough in a lot of industries, such as eating and drinking, gasoline stations, clothing stores, and so forth. But in 2020, certainly there has been significant improvement. Okay, so what industries actually benefited from the pandemic? Non-store retailers. You know who I'm thinking of, Apple, right? So you can see how their sales, the sales of the online e-tailers really took off after the recession began, after the pandemic began. Health and personal care stores. I imagine drugstores are here, but so also are the stores that sell health aids and that sort of thing. There's been a lot more concern about health, our personal health, and you can see that industry has benefited. Electronics and appliance stores have suffered. You can see the decline because the e-tailers have increased their sales. But when the pandemic occurred, even their sales took off because people ran to their stores to get computers and other devices that they could use working from home. And the same thing was true in department stores, which have really seen a decline in their sales over several years, 10 years in this chart. But with the COVID, people went out to get the stuff that they needed at home. Took them a while to do it, and you can see in 2020, this industry really suffered and is now coming back. And the same was true of electronic stores, but the recovery was a little faster. Building materials and garden equipment. People didn't travel in 2020 as much. They couldn't get on airplanes. They couldn't get on trains. A lot of places just were scary because of the pandemic. And so folks stayed home and took care of their yards. And they got sporting goods and enjoyed those more. And so sporting goods stores and manufacturers of sporting goods did quite well right after the pandemic occurred. This takes us then to production, the industries that produce these goods and services. And just as a general proposition, US industry really tanked during 2020. Again, you can see just what a substantial decline occurred during that year. The decline in the first quarter was 17%, which is pretty severe. Crude oil production had been increasing. It decreased as a result of a recession and production cut back in the Mideast, but generally production has increased until the pandemic, when you see the rapid, sharp decline. US industrial capacity utilization is another story completely, but it has to be told in the context of production, because we can see that over the years there has been a decline in the utilization of productive industrial assets. And then when the pandemic occurred, we had another downturn, but we've seen other downturns because certainly recessions make these happen, and so here in the pandemic we saw it again. But there's a more important trend here, and that is that manufacturing and the use of industrial capacity has generally declined over the long term. Auto production and parts production dropped sharply, as we know, came back up, and then has been declining again. And again, one of the problems is the availability of components. Consumer goods generally have fared better. Instead of declining, they've increased. However, the basic industries such as steel, you can see that the steel industry has not been a very healthy one in recent years. And when the COVID occurred, boom, boy, there were less products made of steel, less demand for steel. However, that demand has begun to recover, even though it's in a long-term decline. Here are some trends in producer prices. And again, you can see aluminum and steel. Rather remarkable, because the big industry, the big consumer industry for both of these basic metals companies is automobiles, and in the case of aluminum, also aircraft. And yet both the auto and the aircraft industries during this period, during the pandemic, have declined, yet the prices have gone up. And the reason for prices going up are multiple. The availability of raw material, the difficulty of extracting raw material, the effect of the coronavirus on working crews to do that work, that recovery work, as well as the difficulty in obtaining components such as semiconductors. But as a result, the supply has gone down, the demand has gone up, and so prices have gone up, even though production has gone down. The industrial chemicals prices, you can see that they've really shot up, even though they're like some of the other industries we've talked about. Previously, there was a downtrend. Now we see that inflation and all the changes in the economy, including stimulus payments, have resulted in higher prices. We can see that the prices of building materials such as gypsum and plywood have also shot up drastically. So no doubt about it, we're in an age of higher prices. Now you may wonder why this chart with small arms ammunition prices are here. And this is my somewhat attempt, I don't know whether it's humor or whether sarcasm. I've got a good friend in the small arms and ammunition industry, and he tells me that every time politicians raise a ruckus about ammunition and arms, and claim that arms and ammunition should be taken away from people and that their sales should be controlled or curtailed, and the amount of arms and ammunition reduced drastically. Every time they make these protests, these claims that something should be done about them, the price of the small arms and ammunition rises. So in his view, the politicians who raise their concerns about arms and ammunition are probably doing more to increase the sales of those products than the marketing departments of those companies possibly could accomplish. So the politicians, without knowing it, are the ones that are raising the sales and the prices of arms and ammunition. Sort of a contrary result there. Here we're going to take a look briefly at some trends in employment and unemployment, and we can see that the number of people over 16 searching for a job as a percent of the entire labor force shot up during the pandemic and then have come back down. And the number of people over 16 searching for a job as a percent of the labor force. Oh, I'm sorry, these charts are identical, aren't they? Shame on me. I've got two charts that show us the same thing. Well, all right, I'll fix that. Whoops. There. So here on the lower chart, we've got people who are actively searching for work as a percent of the total labor force. And the total labor force includes people who are working and people who are reporting to the unemployment office looking for work, as well as unemployment insurance. But there's another way to calculate unemployment, and that is to calculate employment, the proportion of people who are actively working as a percent of the total population. And you can see for some time it was pretty stable, and then it rose as the economy got better. And among other things, more women came into the workforce. And then in recent years, the portion of people who are working declined. And if you think back about some of those previous charts, what we're looking at here is the effect of companies moving out of the United States and capacity utilization falling. And so what's happening here is that fewer people are working because fewer companies are producing in the United States. And then we can see what happened during the pandemic. It really dropped. In June of 2021, which would be right at the end of this line, 58% of the US population was employed. That's not a very large number, is it? But in the second quarter of 2020, that proportion had dropped to 51%. And more interesting, perhaps, and that is that in prior years, back in 2019, the portion was 65%. So we went from 65 to 58, and to 51 rather, and then we're back up to 58. But this means that a large portion of the population is not employed, and that's as it should be. Kids, we wouldn't expect kids to be working, and we would not expect seniors to be working. And there are more and more seniors as a portion of the population. But as this proportion falls, the burden on the portion of people who are working that have to provide taxes to support unemployment insurance rises, and we can see that that trend is very definitely apparent. Okay, so let's see here. This is the last chart, by the way, for those of you who are concerned. But this is the trend in, pardon me, let me get this back. The trend in hours of work that have occurred in several industries. And you can see in health and education, this industry, that in 2020 there was a real decline. And when people did not come back to campuses, the campus didn't have to employ people to maintain residence halls, to maintain eating facilities and dining halls, or maintenance. And I suppose probably some instructors were laid off. But you can see that in 2020, and even here in 2021, health and education, and it's really unfortunate that these two are combined. I don't think that healthcare has declined like the education industry has, but the two are combined, and the data provided by the Federal Reserve, which is where I get my data. So we can only make some assumptions about what the impacts are on health and education separately. When we're talking about manufacturing, whether it's manufacturing of durables products or non-durables, you can see that there have been trends over the long term, and as we've discussed earlier, in manufacturing, and that those trends have been negative in nature. We can also see where the red circles are, that when the pandemic occurred, those trends were even aggravated, but that there have then been these little recoveries. Leisure and hospitality, I don't have to tell you, it's been pretty rough on that industry. Hotels, restaurants, and so forth. And even though the recovery has begun, it has far from reached the pre-pandemic level. Professional and business services haven't been hurt quite as much, or maybe I should say they've recovered a little more fully, but even professional services, accounting, the variety, some legal services, but a variety of these services are not as fully employed as they were before the pandemic. And the same is true of financial industries, although the financial industries seem to have fared just a little bit better than the professional and business services have. Where the real hurt exists is in manufacturing, as well as leisure and hospitality, health and education. Okay, so what do we have here? That's what I'd like to ask you. These slides, as well as notes regarding each of these slides, will be posted in your Moodle shell. And you can find at the end of the notes these same questions. But I would like you to prepare brief answers. Well, at least not elaborate answers. You don't have to go and to write a term paper for each of these questions. But based on all that we've talked about here, which industries seem to be the most and least vulnerable to adverse impacts of COVID? Bearing in mind that we're now dealing with the Delta variant, and that after Delta, there could even be another variant. So which industries do you see to be most and least vulnerable? Second, a fairly significant number of public officials have declared the U.S. economy enjoyed a V-shaped recovery. And when you look at those graphs, you can understand that. And the economic effects of COVID won't last much longer. Well, I'm not so sure. So do you agree that the economic impacts of COVID won't last much longer, or that they will last much longer? And what's your reason? What are your reasons? Thirdly, the Federal Reserve Chairman has described the inflationary impacts of COVID as transitory and likely to end soon. And by inflationary impacts, he was talking about price increases. So do you agree that price increases will be over soon, or that they are more likely to last longer, for a longer period of time, for perhaps a couple of years or longer? And again, what are your answers? And it would be a good idea to discuss the role of massive federal stimulus payments on the value of US currency. And to help you with that, I've posted a little humorous paper on your Moodle shell that's only 1 page in length, but it describes the relationship between money supply and inflation. I hope you find it helpful. And finally, the US economic recovery seems to be largely due to large-scale federal spending. The US has done much better than other countries because it has spent a lot more in the way of these stimulus payments. And as I've mentioned, it could be that we'll see another 5 trillion added to the money supply and to stimulus payments. And so we've got large scale federal debt. What economic impacts do you think might occur as a result of high federal debt? Among other things, interest payments. But more than that, if the federal debt is as high as it is, won't that make it difficult for the federal government to fund other necessary expenditures, for instance, for defense. And finally, what economic impacts would you expect when these federal stimulus payments end? We've seen these spikes occur in the graphs as stimulus payments occurred and incomes went up and spending went up. But what happens when stimulus payments are discontinued? It's an interesting question. There's no perfect answer. There's no absolutely right and wrong, but I would like you to think about these things because it's so important. So with that, I'll end this rather long lecture, but I do hope that it has given you some new insights into the economic dynamics of a COVID world that the US is going to have to deal with. So with that, I'll try to end this video so you can go to the bathroom. I'll see you at our next meeting. Goodbye.